Good afternoon. I'm very, very pleased to introduce a friend who is returning. He spoke with us previously. Um, this is Shinmon Michael Newton. He began Zen practice in 1983 as a university student in Japan with Rinzai priest at the ancient temple on Mount Tsukuba, later moving to Kyoto and practicing Soto Zen with Shohaku Akamura. Since returning to Vancouver in 1987, he has practiced with Zoketsu Norman Fisher, receiving priest ordination from him in 2003 and Dharma transmission in 2011. He has been a guiding teacher of Mountain Range Zen community in Vancouver since May 2017 and has taught Asian studies and religious studies at Simon Fraser University. I am so grateful, Shinmon, that you came back to speak to us and so look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you so much.
You, Steve, and how could I not come back, have such a warm welcome the first time, and just to see all these wonderful, friendly faces here, and how joyous you greet each other on the Zoom. It's quite a beautiful community you have created here. And I think the last person maybe who talked with you, I'm not sure, but Yoshin Kate gave a talk just a little bit ago, my partner in Zen and in crime and in home life. So I'm not sure if Kate mentioned, but this practice period that we're in the middle of here in Vancouver, Canada, we're focusing on our woman ancestors, which often we don't seem to know much about our woman ancestors. And as Steve mentioned, I've taught at university for many years in religious studies. I taught, Buddhist studies, Asian studies, that kind of thing. And so I was diving a little bit deep during this practice period into Dogen and his connection with various women that were important students in his life, researching here and there. And so created a kind of a talk, a little centered around that I'd like to share with you today. I think it's important to know our lineage, and our lineage includes very powerful women who actually, I think without our women ancestors, their energy, their commitment, that our practice today would either not be here or it would be very, very different than we see it today.
Okay.
So let me kind of create a little bit of context here for Dogen and what he did to kind of support women's practice as well.
Come here.
So first of all, just to check, everyone can hear me okay? Good, okay. So forgive me if I'm giving you some information that you already know, but here we go. So originally, of course, there was no Buddhism in Japan. Buddhism actually moved through China, through other parts of Asia, arrived in Japan around the year 580, 560. Scholars don't really know. The first people to ordain, the first Japanese to ordain, were actually 3 women. And they could not ordain in Japan, of course, because Japan did not have monks or nuns. So they went to Korea, and which had a very vibrant Buddhist community, monastic as well as lay. And these 3 women ordained in Korea, they came back to Japan and started teaching and offering Buddhist practice among men and among women. So these are our ancestors. These 3 women traveled in a very dangerous journey, across the straits to Korea and then back. And then we know from historical records by the year, let me check my notes here, 623 in the Common Era, there were at least 570 nuns established in nunneries, and another 800 men in other Buddhist communities. So Japan at the beginning had a very strong, vibrant Buddhist community that included both men and women, and to a very great extent. But for various reasons, mainly the fact that Confucianism was coming back, it was coming into Japan and becoming quite strong in the 700s up to the 900s. And Confucians had a very strong view about the roles of gender. The women Sangha began to diminish. They lost funding, they lost the backing of Buddhist institutions, and of course, the male clergy also kind of did not support them as extensively as it could. They kind of marginalized women's ordination, and while there were a few nuns, they certainly, the dynamic energy that was there at the beginning disappeared. And so by the time we get to Dogen, there were no fully ordained women. There were no fully ordained women at all during Dogen's time. And not only that, but the two really strong Buddhist establishments that trained people, in fact, where Dogen got trained on Mount Hiei in the Tendai tradition and in the Shingon tradition, another very powerful Buddhist tradition that was very strong in Japan. In those centers, women were forbidden. They weren't allowed to ascend the mountains because these were kind of university and training establishments on top of two mountains. Women were not even allowed to walk up the mountain there. They had this very strong kind of view of women that that women would hinder practice, essentially, in various ways. So what I found very interesting, both as a male practitioner, as a male priest, and as a scholar, I guess I'd have to say, as a person interested in this stuff, is why did Dogen, when he became an adult, became so supportive of women's practice, which I'll talk about in just a moment? Because as a boy, he was raised on Mount Hiei, and the tradition there was no women, and women were portrayed as hindrances, essentially, to Buddhist practice. Well, there's various theories, but the one I think is really strong and kind of important for us to know is the theory that's proposed by a great scholar, Miriam Levering. And she makes a very strong case that Dogen did not change his mind at all in Japan when he was growing up. It was only when he left and he went to China. And during that time in China, because remember, Dogen went there when he was 23, so still very impressionable young person. And he went with his teacher, Myozen, to learn more about the Zen practice in Japan, or pardon me, in China firsthand. He traveled and studied in a fairly important area that was very vibrant, full of Buddhist practice in the area that, or at least the place that we recognize as China today. We know from the literature that at that time in China, there were a number of Buddhist nuns and laywomen who had received recognition as not only great teachers, but complete Dharma heirs. Some of the nuns were fully recognized and teaching as Zen or Chan teachers, and they themselves had Dharma heirs. Some of them, most of them women Dharma heirs, but even a few male Dharma heirs at that time. This was during the dynasty called the Song dynasty. So they were teaching, these women, these powerful women in China were teaching not only other women, but also men, and not only lay women and men, but also ordained women and men. Not great numbers, of course, but still significant. So when Dogen came back to Japan, he realized that the Japanese attitudes and practices in relation to women students were mistaken. And he very early on took a radically different course from the other very powerful, very large Buddhist establishments around him. And part of this was Dogen's great work to bring Buddhist practice as he understood it in China back to Japan. And the role of women was part of that. He writes very soon after he arrives back to Japan, he writes this. The ancestors say, in understanding Buddha Dharma, men and women, noble and common, are not distinguished. Here we see a very clear statement of equality. Men, women, and not only just men and women, but also the nobles and the common. He said there's no distinction. And that too was a radical teaching that he brought to Japan. So a few years later, after he came back to Japan, he established his own training temple outside Kyoto. And unlike most of the large training temples that were in Japan today, he opened his monastic community to everybody, regardless of their social status, regardless of how intelligent they were, regardless of their sex, regardless of their profession. His practice was, I think, through and through a practice of the people, a practice of all people. He made this teaching for everyone. So one of Dogen's, just to kind of bring this all the way back to our woman ancestors, one of Dogen's very highly respected disciples was a nun, Ryonen. Now, I said there were no fully ordained women during Dogen's time, and that was true. These women were only able to be partially ordained because there weren't, to be fully ordained in the traditional way at that time, there had to be, I think, 5 nuns and 5 male monastics in order to really confirm a full ordination. So these women that I'm talking about were partially ordained, at least by the traditional establishments, understood that. So this nun, Ryonen, we don't really know that much about her life, but we do know that she was older than Dogen. And she unfortunately died before he did. But Dogen wrote in his writings, praised her for her very strong aspiration and for her wisdom and for her compassion. And that was unusual. Dogen didn't point to many people in his Sangha, in his own writings, but Ryonen was one that really stood out. Let me read you an example. This comes from the Eihei Koroku, and he refers directly to this nun, Ryonen. He says this, Wayfarer Ryonen, you have the seeds of prajna, of wisdom from early on in life, intently aspiring to the great way of Buddha ancestors. Without begrudging any effort in nurturing the way, you will demonstrate the precise meaning of coming to the West, of Buddhism coming to Japan. And in later, another discourse, he writes this. He presents a little information about a koan that he talks about a little bit. And then he writes this, again referring directly to this one nun. He says, I stand by your most ardent determination to pursue this path, dear Ryonen, you who far surpass me in understanding of the teaching. I wrote this sermon, this discourse, only to add some color to the Buddhist path. May these words of mine leave alone the undisturbed form and fragrance of things. So here we have this unusual situation where Dogen is praising one of his students, and that student is the nun Donin. I think she must have been a very exceptional practitioner of Zazen, and one that so really thoroughly impressed Dogen. Dogen did write in a couple of other places that he thought Ronen's understanding of the teaching was really quite advanced. And his attitude towards her was really one of not only respect, but of admiration. And I think I would say a gentle sense of intimacy with her. When I was researching this, I found two other nuns that, again, he refers to directly. One was a nun named Eshin, and we don't have much information about her other than, I'll skip that part. But the other one nun was a nun named Egi. And Egi was a very important part of Dogen's Sangha at Eheji, Dogen's main temple. She not only taught and influenced women who were practicing around the Eheji Dogen temples, but she also assisted many of the higher monks in their function, monastic administrative function, particularly after Dogen. Oh yeah, the other thing I should add, she also looked after Dogen when he was sick, just before he died. He was very sick at Eheji before he went to Kyoto, where he died. She was the one who took care of him. And when Dogen, realizing he needed to leave and go to Kyoto, perhaps to find a good doctor or some medicine, he called Egi into his room, along with Gikai, who would become one of the abbots of Eheji, and instructed them both about the administrative functions he wanted them to do while he was gone. So I could go on to talk about Egi, but because there's more to say about her. But I'd like to maybe conclude by saying, Dogen had both lay women and ordained women as students. He clearly respected and honored them both. And his most famous essay, which probably many of you are familiar with, Raihai Tokusui, he is very critical about the misogynistic practices that are common in temples at his time. And if Miriam Levering is right, the scholar, it was really his practice in China that gave Dogen an intercultural point of view that allowed him to question and then reassess what was happening in the Japanese Buddhist traditions. He really challenged the view of women as not being strong practitioners or worthy of learning, or in any way less capable than men. He writes, "What faults do women have? What virtues do men possess? Say you vow not to look at a woman," which is a very common instruction in the monasteries at that time. Say you vow not to look at a woman, and you chant, "Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all." Are you excluding women from the category of sentient beings? If so, you are not a bodhisattva, nor are you exercising Buddhist compassion. The notion of avoiding to look at women is nothing but the words of drunken madness of lesser practitioners. So, pretty clear. And one more quote I'll read. I thought was really good. He said, "It is an excellent custom of study that when a nun has attained the way, attained Dharma, and started to teach, monks who seek the Dharma and should study and join her assembly, bow to her and ask her about the way. It is just like finding water at the time of thirst. So Dogen, I think, clearly was an ally of women. And I would also add the commoner, other kind of categories of people within Japanese society at that time. He was an ally at a time when women experienced severe persecution, well, not exactly persecution, but certainly discrimination within the Buddhist establishment. And yes, of course, Dogen was influenced, subject to the conditions and attitudes of the day, but he was able to challenge the prevailing set views and prejudices. And so while I think it's important to acknowledge Dogen's insights and actions, I think it's even more important to imagine, since they have very little actual written literature, but to imagine the lives and the strong wills of the women who were there at the beginning of our Sotoshu practice in Japan. How they survived, how they, through their commitment and their strong practice, carried this practice through difficult times today. These women, some of them known, but many of them not, really dedicated themselves to Zen practice, overcoming not only their own perhaps internal doubts, but the strong social and institutional oppositions that they faced. I think, well, I won't even say think. For me, knowing even that little bit that we know about their lives, I think they give us really great inspiration for our own practice. So the question is, can we now and here, honoring the early Soto nuns and Dogen, can we honor them by creating a space, a container for practice that's open and safe for all people? And when we stumble, can we compassionately return to our deep intention to welcome everybody and question our own views of right and wrong, good and bad, proper and improper? Can we question, just as Dogen did at that time, our own assumptions and our own convictions as we create a container for Sangha? So I thought, I see perhaps I'm a minute or two over. I'd like to end though with a little poem. This is a poem written by a Soto nun, a poet who was a close friend and I guess maybe pupil of the famous Zen monk Ryokan, who was that great poet in Japan in 1800s. So this nun, her name is Teishin, and she writes this: in the morning, bowing to all. In the evening, bowing to all. Respecting others is my only calling. Hail to the never despising Bodhisattva. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening. Look forward to our discussion after our little bit of Zazen here.